The year was 1243, and the road between Vrenthal and the salt mines of Ashford was not kind to travelers after dark. Dante had learned this the hard way. He was 13 years old and small for his age. A boy with dark, wind-tangled hair, clever brown eyes, and the kind of lean, quick body that came from years of never staying in one place long enough to eat well. He worked for Master Cale's trading caravan as a runner and errand boy, carrying messages between merchants, fetching water from wells, loading barrels that were always heavier than he expected. It was not a glorious life, but it was a life, and Dante had known worse. That night, the caravan camped near the base of a hill, and Dante had been sent ahead to check the road past the ridge. He had not expected the shadows moving between the trees. He had not expected the sound of iron-shod boots or the rough laughter of men who smelled of ale and violence. Bandits. He did not wait to count them. He ran. The forest took him quickly. The real forest, not the thinned woodland near the road, but the ancient, root-tangled dark that grew thicker and stranger the deeper one went. Branches whipped his face. Roots rose from the earth like old hands trying to trip him. He could hear the men behind him for a while, shouting, crashing, and then, gradually, nothing. The forest swallowed all sound. Dante ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed against the base of an enormous oak tree. Its bark was silver in the moonlight. Its roots were so thick and twisted that they formed a kind of hollow seat, and Dante pressed himself into it, gasping, his heart slamming against his ribs. He waited. Nothing came. Slowly, very slowly, he looked up. The forest around him was unlike any forest he had ever seen. He had grown up traveling the roads of 3 kingdoms, sleeping under more skies than he could count, and he had seen forests that were beautiful, and forests that were terrible, and forests that were simply dark. But this was different. The trees here were massive, older than anything that had a name. Their trunks rose like the columns of cathedrals, and their canopies interlocked so high above that the sky between them was barely a suggestion, a scattering of distant silver light. But that light was not only coming from above, it was coming from the forest itself. The mushrooms growing along the roots emitted a faint blue luminescence. The moss covering the rocks glowed faintly green. Flowers, pale, delicate things Dante could not name, opened and released tiny motes of light that drifted upward like reversed snow. And the air smelled of rain and deep earth and something sweeter than anything Dante had encountered in any market or meadow. Something old, something alive in a way that was different from ordinary life. He stood slowly, one hand still pressed against the oak. He was not afraid, which surprised him. He had expected to be terrified. Instead, something quieter had settled in his chest, a stillness like the moment before a song begins. He walked. There was no path, but the forest guided him anyway. The light was always slightly brighter ahead, the ground slightly smoother, the roots arranged in ways that made walking easy if one followed the natural channels between them. Dante did not question this. He simply followed. An hour passed, or 2, or perhaps time moved differently here. Then the trees thinned, and he stepped out onto the bank of a lake. It was a small lake, perhaps 30 strides across, and it should have been dark at this hour, a black mirror beneath the night sky. Instead, it was luminous. Silver flowers with petals like blown glass grew along the water's edge, and each petal held a bead of light at its center, and the whole surface of the lake reflected this in rippling silver patterns. The water itself was so clear that Dante could see the stones at the bottom, each one distinct, each one lightly glowing. He stood at the edge of this place, breathless, and then he saw her. She was seated on a large stone at the far side of the lake, a stone draped in such thick moss it looked more like a throne than a rock. She was tall, even seated, and her presence held the kind of stillness that reminded Dante of mountains, something that did not move because it had no reason to. Her hair was long and gold pale, falling over her shoulders and down to her waist in gentle waves, and even in the silver light of the lake it seemed to hold some warmth, some color that the rest of the world at night could not quite reach. She was looking at him. Her eyes were the color of deep forest in spring, green so vivid it seemed almost to glow, and her expression was one of genuine, unhurried curiosity. She wore a gown of layered fabrics in silver and pale green and ivory, stitched with patterns that, when Dante looked carefully, resembled leaves and stars and vines. Small particles of light drifted from the fabric when she moved, the same motes he had seen rising from the flowers. She was not human. Dante knew this with complete certainty. Not from fear, and not from any visible mark of strangeness, but simply from the quality of her presence, the way the whole forest seemed to orient itself around her, as a river orients around a stone. He stood very still, one foot still in the shadow of the tree line. She tilted her head, the way a person might tilt their head when observing a rare bird that has appeared unexpectedly in their garden. "A human," she said. Her voice was soft and musical, each word carrying the faint resonance of something much older than its syllables. She spoke in the common tongue with an accent Dante could not place, lilting and precise all at once. "I haven't seen one in a very long time." Dante opened his mouth. Nothing came out. She smiled, and the smile was warm, genuinely warm, not the polished warmth of a noble woman who has learned to smile at the right moments, but the kind that reached the eyes and stayed. You are frightened of me," she said, not unkindly. "No," Dante said, which was the truth and which seemed to surprise them both. She studied him with those luminous green eyes, and after a moment she made a small gesture with one hand, the way one might gesture to a seat at a familiar table. "Then come closer. You look as though you have been running." He had. His tunic was torn at the sleeve where a branch had caught it. His boots were muddied past the ankle. There was a cut along his jaw from where he had stumbled in the dark. He walked forward until he was close enough to see the faint patterns of light moving beneath her skin. Not a wound, not a glow exactly, just the suggestion of light the way a candle shows through cloth, and stopped a few feet from the stone. "What are you?" he asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "What are you?" She replied, still gently amused. "A boy. I work for a merchant caravan. We were camped near the Ashford Road and you ran," she said, "into my forest. Is it yours?" She looked out across the lake for a moment. "It has been mine for longer than your kingdom has had a name." She paused. "My name is Alvira. I am the queen of this place. What is yours?" "Dante." She repeated the name quietly, as though she were tasting it. Dante. A traveler's name. Her gaze returned to him, thoughtful. "Are you hungry?" He was in fact extremely hungry. He had not eaten since morning. "A little," he said, because it felt wrong to admit the full extent of it. She reached into the moss beside her and produced a cluster of small fruits, deep violet, each one perfectly round, and held them out toward him. He stepped forward and took them carefully from her palm, and the moment his fingers closed around them, he felt the warmth in them, the same quiet aliveness that was in everything here. He ate one. It tasted of berries and spring water and something else, something without a name, something that made the tiredness in his legs ease and the cut on his jaw feel less sharp. He looked up at her. She was watching him with that same calm curiosity, as though he were a chapter in a book she had long wanted to read. "You can stay until morning," she said. "The forest will shelter you. My people will not harm you." As if in answer, 3 small creatures emerged from the roots of a nearby tree, hardly larger than his fist, each glowing faintly blue-white, with delicate features and expressions of severe professional curiosity. They examined him from a polite distance, then withdrew. "Your people," Dante said. "My people," Alvira confirmed. He sat down on the bank of the lake, not far from her stone, and looked out across the silver water. "Will you tell me about this place?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, and then she began to speak, and her voice, carrying across the still water of that ancient lake, seemed to fill the whole forest, not loudly, but deeply, the way music fills a room not by volume but by presence. And Dante, a boy of 13 who had run from bandits into an impossible forest and found a queen made of moonlight and old magic, sat in the roots of a silver oak and listened until the night grew soft around the edges. He did not dream of leaving. Not yet. The forest did not let go of him easily. Dante had intended to leave the next morning. He told himself this with great conviction as he woke beneath the roots of the silver oak, wrapped in a cloak of woven moss that one of Alvira's small glowing creatures had placed over him while he slept. He would return to the road. He would find Master Kale's caravan, or another one. He would continue the life he had always known, moving, working, surviving. He stood. He brushed the earth from his tunic. He looked toward the tree line. Then one of the small luminous creatures appeared at his feet, carrying in both its tiny hands a leaf folded into the shape of a cup filled with water so clear it was almost invisible. It looked up at him with enormous pale eyes and an expression of patient expectation. Dante took the cup. He drank. The water tasted of deep springs and cold stone and something quietly electric, and by the time he lowered the leaf cup, the conviction about leaving had not disappeared, but it had become somehow less urgent, like a task he fully intended to complete after one more interesting thing had happened. That was the nature of the Bosque de Lúmen, he would come to understand. It did not trap anyone. It simply made the world outside it seem, by comparison, a little less worth hurrying toward. He stayed. 3 days became a week became 2. The small glowing creatures, Alvira called them fairy, an old word that translated roughly as wandering lights, adopted him with the brisk efficiency of beings who have decided a stray animal is now their responsibility. They showed him the safe paths through the forest, the ones where the ground did not give way into bogs, where the thorned vines grew thick enough to block passage, where the white deer walked at dawn and could not be startled without unsettling the whole forest's mood for an afternoon. They showed him the fruit trees, heavy with violet clusters and pale golden spheres that tasted like concentrated summer, and the streams where the water ran silver over beds of luminescent stone. They showed him the hollow hills where older things slept and made clear with much serious pointing and head shaking that those places were not for visiting. And every evening, without plan or arrangement, Dante found himself at the lake. Alvira was always there. She moved through her kingdom with the ease of someone who has never had reason to be elsewhere. She walked barefoot over moss and root and stone with the same unhurried grace, and wherever she passed, the forest responded, flowers opening as she approached, small animals emerging from undergrowth to regard her with the calm trust of creatures who have never been given cause for fear. The light around her shifted with her mood in subtle ways, warmer when she was pleased, cooler when she was thinking, and occasionally when she laughed, briefly iridescent in a way that had no natural explanation. She was not what Dante had expected a magical queen to be. He had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. The bards who traveled the road sang of fairy queens as distant and terrible, creatures of cold beauty who took human children and left stones in their place, who bargained for souls with honeyed words, who were lovely the way lightning is lovely, best admired from a distance you couldn't cross. Alvira was not like that. She was curious, genuinely, actively curious in the way of someone for whom the world has remained interesting across a very long time, which is rarer than it sounds. She asked Dante questions about the cities he had passed through, about the wars he had heard of at the edges of roads, about what common people ate and how they built their houses and what songs they sang when they thought no one was listening. She listened to his answers with complete attention, the kind that made a person feel their words were worth something. In return, she answered his questions honestly, which surprised him. "How old are you?" he asked one evening, sitting on the bank while she sat on her moss stone and the ferry drifted around them like small sleepy stars. She considered this for a moment. "Old enough that the counting stopped being useful," she said. "I remember when the mountains to the north were younger, when the sea came closer to this forest than it does now." She paused. "Time moves differently for my kind. A century is what a season is to you. We are present in it. We feel its passage, but it does not diminish us the same way. Does that mean you never die? It means we die differently." Her voice carried no particular weight on this, only the careful precision of someone describing a thing accurately, slowly, fading rather than falling. A queen of the forest does not end like a candle goes out. She goes out the way a lake dries, gradually over generations, the light retreating. Dante was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "That sounds lonely," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted. Not visibly, but in the way the air around her shifted, a small, warm change. "It has been," she said simply. "At times, they spoke of many things." She taught him the names of the stars as her people called them, not the constellation names he had learned from a traveling astronomer, but older names, descriptive names, names that told stories in themselves. She taught him which plants in the forest had healing properties and how to prepare them, which he absorbed with the practical focus of a boy accustomed to making do with what was available. She taught him 3 words in the old Fey language, which he promptly forgot one of and had to ask for again, which made her laugh the light, wind-swept laugh he had heard on his first night. He told her about his life before the caravan. He told her about growing up in the port city of Vailmore, the smell of salt and fish and tar that had been the air of his earliest years, the way the tide came in against the old stone walls and left rings of foam on the cobblestones. He told her about his mother, who had been a seamstress and had died of a fever when he was 9, and how after that he had simply begun walking in the direction that seemed most likely to lead somewhere, and had not really stopped since. She listened to all of it. She did not offer comfort in the practiced way that adults sometimes offered it, saying the right words with the distance of someone who has already filed the sadness away, and would like you to do the same." She simply listened, and then she said, "You have covered a great deal of ground for someone your age." "I like moving," he said. "When you stay still too long, the world seems smaller. And when you move too long," he thought about it honestly, "you forget what it felt like to have a home." She nodded once, slowly, and said nothing, and somehow that was exactly right. One night a storm came through the forest, not a violent one, but the slow, heavy kind that rolls in from the mountains and settles over everything like a gray blanket, rain falling in long vertical sheets between the trees. Dante sat under the wide canopy of the silver oak while the foresee retreated into the roots, and Alvira stood at the edge of the lake with her face turned upward, letting the rain fall on her skin. She looked peaceful in a way that was different from her usual composure. The rain flattened her golden hair and darkened the fabric of her gown, and she did not seem to notice or care. And in the gray, rain-blurred light, she looked less like a queen and more like something elemental, like the forest itself had taken a form that could stand and look up at the sky. Dante watched her from under his oak. After a while she turned and walked back to him, unhurried, and sat down beside him in the roots. She was wet and she smelled of rain and moss and that sweet, undefinable something that was always present around her. The small electric warmth that her presence always carried felt close like this, like sitting near a fire, not burning, but unmistakably there. "You should sleep," she said. "You were walking half the day." "I'm not tired," he said, which was half true. She gave him a look of gentle skepticism that he was already learning to recognize. "You have the eyes of someone who is tired and doesn't want to admit it. You always know when I'm not telling the whole truth," he said. "Yes," she said simply. He looked out at the rain on the lake. "I don't want to leave," he said. The words came out before he decided to say them. She was quiet for a moment. "You will," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only certainty. "The world is too loud for you to stay silent in it forever. You have too much curiosity left to spend it all in one forest. And when I go, then you go." He turned to look at her, and she was looking out at the rain and the small lights in the moss around them reflected off the water in her wet hair, and he felt something he didn't have a name for yet, something large and quiet that lived in the chest, not quite aching but pressing. "Will you still be here?" he asked. She turned to look at him, and her green eyes in the rain-gray light were very steady. "I am always here," she said. "This forest is what I am. I don't go elsewhere." He nodded. He looked down at his hands. Then, with the complete and uncalculated sincerity that belongs only to the very young and the very honest, he said, "When I grow up, I'm going to come back and marry you." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock or rejection. It was a longer, softer silence, the kind that precedes something being carefully considered. Then Alvira laughed. It was a beautiful sound, light and genuine, like wind moving through the upper branches of the tallest trees, like the first note of music played in an empty hall. It held no mockery, no dismissal. It held something warmer than either. She looked at him, and her eyes were luminous with the laughter still in them, and she said, "Then grow up first, and come back and claim me." Dante felt the words settle in his chest the way a stone settles into deep water, with certainty and without sound. He smiled. He believed her completely, and a week later, when the road called louder than the forest's quiet voice, he stood at the tree line at dawn with his small pack over one shoulder and turned back one last time. Alvira stood at the edge of the lake, her golden hair catching the first light of morning, one hand raised in farewell. He raised his hand in return. Then he walked out of the forest and back into the loud, complicated, indifferent world of men. He did not know then how many years would pass before he returned. He did not know what those years would cost him, or what form he would wear when he finally walked back through those trees. He did not know about the wars, the roads, the slow attrition of decades, or the terrible offer made in the dark by a creature far older than himself. He only knew the promise. And that, for the time being, was enough. The world outside the Bosque de Lúmen was exactly as loud as Alvira had said it would be. Dante re-entered it at dawn and did not stop moving for 30 years. He found Master Cale's caravan 2 days east of the forest, camped near a river crossing, the merchant himself in a foul mood over the losses from the bandit attack. Dante said nothing about where he had been or what he had seen. He simply picked up a crate, loaded it onto a cart, and returned to work as though the gap in time were unremarkable. Master Cale asked no questions. The road demanded too much attention for questions. For 3 years he travelled the trade routes of the northern kingdoms, Vrenthal, Ashford, the grey port city of Morath, where the sea came in cold and violent against black stone piers. He learned how trade worked, how men negotiated and lied and occasionally told the truth, how the same coin could be worth different things in different hands. He grew taller, his shoulders broadened, the quick, instinctive alertness he had always carried sharpened into something more deliberate. At 16, he left the caravan and joined a merchant's private guard, not because he wanted to fight, but because the pay was better and the travel was faster. He learned the sword from an aging soldier named Grek, who had fought in 4 wars and survived all of them through the unglamorous strategy of being careful. Grek was not a graceful teacher. He taught Dante the way one teaches someone to swim by describing the water's character honestly. It is cold, it is heavy, it will drown you if you let it, and the only sensible response is to learn its movements better than it knows yours. Dante learned. By 20, he was competent. By 25, he was formidable. Not in the showy way of men who fight for reputation. He had no interest in that. But in the quiet, efficient way of someone for whom violence was a last resort that had simply been arrived at often enough to become familiar. He thought about Alvira, not constantly, not in the way of someone consumed by a single idea, but steadily, the way one thinks about a compass point. On certain nights, when the sky cleared and the stars were very bright, he would look up and remember the names she had taught him. When he passed through forests, which he often did, he would notice the quality of the light and think, not like hers. When he heard music, the traveling bards, the songs of harvest festivals, the occasional cathedral choir in the larger cities, he would think of the way her voice carried across water. He was not waiting, he was living. But the direction of his living had a gravity to it, a slow, consistent pull, and the pull pointed toward the Bosque de Lúmen. He told himself he would return when he was older, more settled, when he had something worth returning with. Years have a way of disagreeing with that kind of plan. At 32, he joined a mercenary company operating in the disputed borderlands between 3 kingdoms, whose names changed depending on which side of the argument one stood on. The work was grim, and the country was cold, and the causes were, on examination, not causes at all, but property disputes wearing the clothes of ideology. Dante did not love the work, but he was good at it, and goodness at a thing has a way of binding one to it longer than one intends. He fought in 7 campaigns over 12 years. He was wounded 3 times, once badly, a spear through the side that left a scar he would carry for the rest of his human life, puckered and white, a reminder of the particular gap between being good at surviving and being guaranteed to survive. He thought after that wound that perhaps it was time. He was 44, still strong, still sharp, but aware for the first time in his life of the body's arithmetic, the way it kept a running count of every hard night and cold morning and near miss, and would eventually present the total. He had money. He had enough reputation to move freely. He had, in short, all the things he had told himself he needed. He turned west toward the forest. But the road between a man and his intentions is never as straight as it looks on the rare occasions when someone bothers to draw a map. A plague had spread through the river valleys that year. Not the sudden catastrophic kind, the slow grinding kind that emptied villages one by one and left the roads between them lined with cairns. Dante spent 2 years helping where he could. He had learned enough of Alvira's plant medicine in the Bosque de Lúmen to be genuinely useful, and the knowledge of which herbs reduced fever and which prevented the spread of infection was worth more in those valleys than any sword skill he possessed. He did not regret those 2 years. He would not, looking back, have chosen differently. But time is not returned to those who spend it well. It is simply spent. He was 46 when he finally turned west again. He was 51 when the Second War found him. This one closer to home, a kingdom fracturing along old fault lines that everyone had pretended were healed. He was too old to be conscripted and too recognizable to be ignored, and so he was pressed into service as a tactical advisor, a role that kept him alive but kept him moving in the wrong direction for another 4 years. By the time the war ended, he was 55, and the mirror showed him a stranger with gray at his temples and lines at the corners of his eyes that had not been there a decade ago. He stared at the mirror for a long time one evening in a border town inn, and what he felt was not vanity. He had never been vain, but something more practical and more frightening. He was running out of time. Not in the abstract way that all men run out of time, but in the specific, immediate way of a man who has made a promise to a woman who does not age and who is aging and who has perhaps misunderstood for decades what it would mean to return to her as something other than the boy she remembered. He left the next morning. He walked for 3 weeks through autumn country, the leaves turning gold and red, and the air carrying the first bite of winter in its evenings. And somewhere in those weeks, on a road through a high forest in the borderlands, he encountered the creature. He almost missed it. It was sitting against a tree beside the road, very still, and if Dante had not spent 30 years cultivating the habit of noticing things that were not quite right, he would have walked past it in the dusk and thought nothing of it. But something made him stop. The figure was old in a way that had nothing to do with years. It was tall and thin, dressed in clothing that had been fine once and now hung like cobwebs, and its skin was the gray-white of old ash, and its eyes, when it opened them, were the color of dried blood, dark red, almost brown, with a faint luminescence at the center. A vampire. Dante had heard of them, of course. Everyone had. The folklore of every kingdom he had traveled through carried some version of the story. The undead lords, the nightwalkers, the blood drinkers who had traded mortality for something cold and permanent. In most versions of the story, they were monsters, predators wearing the shapes of men, the enemy of everything living. In a few older versions, told in quieter voices, they were something more complicated. He stood in the road, And the vampire looked at him, and neither of them moved for a long moment. "You are not afraid," the creature said. Its voice was very old, not frail, but layered, the way very old stone is layered, each year pressed thin against the next. "I've been afraid of things that were trying to kill me," Dante said. "You don't seem to be." "No," it agreed. "I am dying. A vampire. Dying." Dante had not known that was possible. He stepped closer. "Can that happen?" "Everything ends," it said. "Only the speed differs. My kind does not die of age. We die when we choose to, or when something stronger than us chooses for us. I have chosen." "Why?" The creature studied him with those dark, luminous eyes. "Because I have been in the world long enough." It paused. "But you have not. I can see it on you. You are a man who has lived a long life and still has unfinished business in it." Another pause. "What is it that you cannot leave behind?" Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A promise." The vampire's expression shifted, and what moved through it was not contempt or amusement, but something that looked unexpectedly like recognition. "A promise made to something that does not age." "Yes." "And you have aged." "Yes." The creature was silent for a long time. The forest around them settled into its nighttime quiet, the birds stilling, the leaves barely moving. I could give you what you need," it said at last. "Not as a gift, as a transfer. My blood carries what I am, what all of us are, the night's permanence, the body that does not diminish." Its dark eyes held his steadily. "You would not be what you are now. You would not age. You would not die of ordinary things. But you would carry new hungers and new limits, and the world of men would no longer be entirely yours to move through in daylight." "And you?" Dante asked. "I would be finished," it said simply. "Which is what I want." Dante stood in the road for a long time. He thought about the mirror in the inn. He thought about the arithmetic of years, the gray at his temples, the scar on his side. He thought about Alvira standing at the edge of her lake in the rain, one hand raised in farewell, patient as the forest itself. He thought about what it would mean to walk back into those trees as a man of 55 who would be dead within 30 years. He thought about what it would mean to never walk back at all. He made his decision, not from ambition, not from fear of death in the ordinary sense, from a promise made beside a silver lake, in a forest that remembered everything. "Tell me what it requires," he said. The creature told him. It was not painless. It was not clean. The 3 nights that followed were the hardest of Dante's life, harder than any battlefield, harder than the wound that had almost killed him at 44. And when they were over, he lay on the cold ground of the forest until dawn, and then retreated from it instinctively, and understood for the first time what he had become. He lay in the dark of a cave through the first day and took stock of himself. His body had not changed in shape. He was still the man he had been. But the gray at his temples was gone. The lines at his eyes had smoothed. The scar on his side remained. Some things even transformation cannot erase. But it no longer ached as it had in cold weather. His senses were different. The dark of the cave was not dark to him. The sounds of the forest outside came in with a clarity that was almost overwhelming before he learned to manage it. And there was a coldness to him now, a stillness in the chest where the heartbeat had been. That was not absence so much as replacement, something ancient and quiet living in the space where mortality had been. He spent 50 more years learning what he was. He spent 50 more years waiting until he trusted himself enough to return to a place he loved. He spent 1 century in total, From the night of the promise to the night, he finally walked back through the tree line of the Bosque de Lúmen, his dark hair untouched by gray, his eyes the color of old garnets in the dark. The forest recognized him immediately. The flowers opened. The fairy appeared between the roots, their small luminous faces turned upward. The trees seemed to exhale. And from the direction of the lake, moving through the silver-lit dark, with the same unhurried grace she had always carried, came Alvira. She stopped when she saw him. He stopped when he saw her. A century had passed, and she was exactly as he remembered. Golden hair, green eyes, that quiet, warm presence that made the whole forest feel like home. She looked at him with an expression that moved through surprise and recognition, and something deeper than either, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then she said very quietly, "Dante." He stepped forward until he was standing before her, close enough to see the small motes of light drifting from her skin, and he went down on one knee on the moss. His dark eyes looked up at her. "I grew up," he said. "As you asked." The forest held its breath. That was the only way Dante could describe it afterward. The particular quality of stillness that settled over the Bosque de Lúmen in the moment he knelt before Alvira. A stillness that was not absence of sound but presence of attention, as though every living thing in the forest had paused and turned toward the lake. The fairy had stopped drifting. The silver flowers at the water's edge stood perfectly motionless. Even the lake's surface, always moving with the faint breath of underground springs, lay flat and mirror still, reflecting the moon with the precision of polished glass. Alvira looked down at him for a long moment. Her expression was not easy to read. It never had been, even when he was a boy of 13, sitting in her roots and asking her questions she answered with the patience of mountains. But there was something moving through it now that he had not seen before, something that lived beneath the composure, beneath the centuries of careful stillness, something that had been waiting a long time to move. "Stand up," she said softly. He stood. She reached out and touched his face with both hands, her fingers cool and light, tracing the lines of his jaw, his cheekbones, the familiar architecture of a face she had memorized a century ago in a different form. He was older now in appearance than he had been when he left, and yet not old. Arrested somewhere in the middle distance of a life, the gray gone, the lines of hard decades smoothed away by what he had become, but the essential structure unchanged. The same dark hair, the same eyes, different now in color but not in character. Still watching, still curious, still honest. "You are cold," she said. "Yes. You are not entirely what you were." No, she did not say this with judgment. She said it with the precision of someone describing a thing accurately, the way she had always spoken. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her everything. They walked as he spoke, not toward anywhere in particular, simply along the lake's edge in the silver dark, the forest quiet around them and the ferry trailing at a respectful distance. He told her about the decades on the road, the wars and the plague years and the long campaigns in cold country. He told her about the mirror in the inn and the arithmetic he had done standing before it. He told her about the creature on the road, its dark eyes and its offer, and the 3 nights that had followed, which he described plainly and without drama, because drama would have been dishonest about what they had actually felt like. He told her about the 50 years of learning what he was, the new hungers he had learned to manage, the new relationship with daylight, the gradual understanding of what it meant to carry something ancient in a body that looked young. He told her about the years he had spent in the world's margins, the old libraries, the forgotten monasteries, the conversations with creatures like himself who had survived long enough to have become something almost like wise. He told her about the folklore he had encountered, the stories humans told about his kind, some of them wrong in ways that were almost funny, some of them right in ways that were not funny at all. He told her about the years he had spent waiting until he trusted himself enough to return to a place he loved without being a danger to it. "I did not want to come back as something that could harm this forest," he said, "or anything in it." Alvira was quiet for a moment. "And now? Now I am what I am," he said. "And what I am is something that has kept a promise for 100 years and would like, if you are willing, to keep it properly." She stopped walking. They were at the far end of the lake, where the silver flowers grew thickest and an old willow trailed its branches in the water. The moon was directly above them, large and clear, and in its light, Alvira's golden hair carried the silver tinge he remembered from childhood, that faint luminescence that appeared in certain lights, as though the moon recognized her and responded in kind. She looked at him for a long time. "You understand what you are asking," she said. "Not a question." "I've had a century to think about it," he said. "I understand it better than most things I've ever asked for." "A fairy queen and a vampire lord," she said, and there was a note in her voice he had not heard before, something wry and warm at once. "The old stories would not know what to do with us." "The old stories," Dante said, "were written by people who weren't there." Something shifted in her expression then. Something opened, the way a door opens that has been closed a very long time, and the warmth that had always been present in her came forward without its usual careful management, and she laughed. It was the same laugh he remembered, light and genuine, wind through high branches, the first note of music in an empty hall, unchanged by a century, unchanged by anything. When the laughter settled, she looked at him with her green eyes very bright in the moonlight, and she said, "Then ask me properly." He had not planned the words. He had thought over the years that perhaps he should, that a man who had carried a promise for 100 years ought to have something prepared, something worthy of the occasion. But standing here beside the silver lake in the forest that had never forgotten him, with the moon overhead and the fairy watching from the roots, and Alvira looking at him with those ancient luminous eyes, prepared words seemed like the wrong instrument for the moment. He said what was true. "I have been moving my whole life," he said. "I stopped long enough once to find the only place that felt like it was worth returning to. I spent a century making sure I was something that deserved to return." He paused. "Alvira, I am asking you to let this be the place I come back to, permanently. I am asking you to marry me." The forest was very still. Then she stepped forward and took his face in her hands again, and this time she was close enough that the warmth of her presence, that quiet fire that was the opposite of his cold, was something he could feel in the spaces between his fingers, at the edge of his jaw, in the still center of his chest. "Yes," she said simply. The wedding of the fairy queen and the vampire lord was not a grand ceremony in any human sense of the word. There were no witnesses in fine clothing, no stone cathedral, no feast laid on long tables. The Bosque de Lúmen conducted its own version of such things, and its version was older and stranger, and, in its way, more complete. It happened 3 nights after his return, at the hour when the moon stood highest. The fairy arranged themselves along the lake's edge in a long, luminous line, their soft blue-white light reflecting in the water. The silver flowers, which bloomed only under certain conditions that Dante still did not fully understand, opened all at once, filling the air with a scent that was halfway between perfume and weather. The white deer came down from the hills, 7 of them, moving through the trees with their particular silence, standing at the forest's edge in a semicircle as though they had been asked. The trees themselves flowered. It was not the right season for it. It did not matter. The oldest trees of the Bosque de Lúmen had always operated on a calendar that answered to something other than temperature and rainfall, and on this night they agreed that flowering was appropriate. And so they did. Small white blossoms opening along branches that should have been bare, their petals catching the moonlight and holding it, the whole canopy above the lake becoming a slow, luminous drift of falling white. Alvira stood at the water's edge in a gown that seemed to have been made from the forest itself, silk the color of winter moonlight, stitched with patterns of leaves and stars that moved faintly, as though the stitching breathed. Her golden hair was loose, and in the full moonlight the silver in it was very bright. Dante stood across from her in the dark velvet and silver of his lord's attire, the signet ring on his finger catching the light, his dark eyes warmer than their color suggested. There were no words spoken that Dante could later report in any human language. What passed between them was in the old tongue of the forest, Alvira's tongue, the language that predated kingdoms and wars and the rise of cities, a language made of light and breath and the specific vibration of old living things. He did not understand it in the way one understands words. He understood it the way one understands music, in the chest, not the mind. What he knew afterward was this: something had been completed, some circuit closed. A century of open space between a promise and its fulfillment had collapsed into the present moment, and the present moment was this forest and this lake and this woman and himself, and it was sufficient. She kissed him. Her lips were warm in a way that his were not, and the contrast between them, her warmth, his cool, her light, his dark, did not feel like opposition. It felt like the specific way that two different things can fit together because their differences are precisely complementary, the way a key fits a lock, not despite being shaped differently from it, but because of it. The foresee erupted in light. It was not a controlled or dignified display. It was the uninhibited illumination of small beings who had been waiting with considerable patience and now had permission to celebrate, and they celebrated thoroughly, shooting upward in spirals, drawing patterns across the dark above the lake, trailing light through the willow branches, and skimming the water's surface until the whole lake was a moving field of silver and gold. The white deer stepped forward from the tree line. The flowers fell. The forest, which had held its breath since the moment Dante knelt on the moss, exhaled. In the months that followed, Dante learned the deeper grammar of the Bosque de Lúmen. He learned the hollow hills and which old things slept in them and what they required in the way of respect. He learned the boundary lines where the forest influence faded and the world of men began, and how to move between those two territories without carrying the wrong thing in either direction. He learned that his vampiric nature and the forest's magic were not incompatible, that the Bosque de Lúmen was old enough to contain contradictions, to hold both the living and the unliving without requiring either to become something else. He was not what he had been. He would never be that again. But the boy who had run into this forest in terror and found silver light and a queen made of moonlight and old magic, that boy's essential character had survived the century entire. The curiosity, the honesty, the capacity to sit beside a lake and listen to a voice, carry stories across water, and feel, without irony, that this was enough. Alvira learned him again in this new form. She learned the limits of his daylight hours and built her own schedule around them without complaint. The way water builds its course around stone, not with effort, but with the natural intelligence of something that knows how to move. She learned that he still liked to sit at the water's edge in the evenings and watch the ferry drift, which she found, he suspected, quietly endearing. He learned that she had been lonelier than she ever said during the century he was gone. Not devastated, she was too old and too rooted to be devastated by absence, but genuinely, persistently lonely in the way of someone who has had a glimpse of a particular kind of company and then been without it for 100 years. He did not apologize for the time. It could not be returned, and she did not want apology. He simply stayed. On a night in late autumn, sitting at the edge of the lake with the last of the silver flowers still holding their light and the ferry drowsing in the roots, and Alvira beside him close enough that her warmth reached him across the small distance, Dante looked at the stars reflected in the water and said their names. Her names. The old names she had taught a 13-year-old boy in a single night, and which he had carried without knowing why across a century. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You remembered all of them. I had a long time to practice." She turned to look at him, and in her green eyes, ancient and warm and present, he saw exactly what he had promised himself he would come back for. Not the magic, not the immortality, not the forest or the light or the impossible beauty of this place. Her, the specific quality of her attention, the way she listened, the way she answered honestly, the warmth she had extended without condition or reserve to a frightened boy who had stumbled into her kingdom with muddy boots and no particular reason to trust her. He had crossed a century to return it. Some promises, made in the unguarded sincerity of youth, survive everything that life can place between them and their fulfillment. The Bosque de Lúmen remembered all of them.